In the unforgiving Arizona desert of 1882, where justice was measured by the speed of your draw and mercy was as rare as water in drought season, one man's lonely journey was about to collide with an act of cruelty so shocking it would ignite a war that would echo across the entire territory. Jake Morrison had been riding the dusty trails for 3 long years, a ghost of the man he once was, carrying nothing but bitter memories and a loaded gun. He thought he'd seen the worst of human nature, claim jumpers who'd kill for a handful of silver, cattle barons who'd burn entire families out of their homes, outlaws who'd shoot a man in the back for the coins in his pocket. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what he was about to discover in the dying town of Clearwater Creek. It started with a sound. A desperate, heart-wrenching cry that cut through the desert heat like a knife through silk. Most men would have ridden on, telling themselves it wasn't their business, that survival meant keeping your head down and your gun holstered. But Jake Morrison wasn't most men. And when he kicked open that wooden crate and saw what the Maddox brothers had done, when he looked into the terrified green eyes of Sarah Fletcher, everything changed. What you're about to witness is a story of courage against impossible odds, of a broken man finding his purpose again, and of 2 souls who refused to let evil triumph. This is the tale of how a lonely cowboy's decision to do what was right sparked a rebellion that would shake the very foundations of an empire built on fear and cruelty. But before we ride into this epic tale of justice and redemption, I need you to do something for me. If you love stories of the Old West, tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and adventures that remind us why courage matters, then hit that subscribe button right now. Seriously, click it. Your support keeps these stories coming, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. While you're at it, give this video a thumbs up. It helps more people discover these incredible stories. And here's the most important part. I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done if you heard someone crying for help? Would you have investigated, or would you have ridden away? Your answers might just inspire our next story. Now, let's saddle up and ride into a tale that will leave you on the edge of your seat. This is the story of Jake Morrison, Sarah Fletcher, and the day a simple act of human decency changed the course of history in the American West. The scorching Arizona sun hung like a merciless furnace in the cloudless sky, its rays beating down on Jake Morrison's weathered, leather-brown face as he guided his horse through the dusty main street of Clearwater Creek. The heat was oppressive, the kind that made a man's shirt stick to his back and his throat feel like sandpaper. Sweat beaded on his forehead beneath the brim of his worn black hat, a hat that had seen too many towns, too many sunsets, too many lonely nights under the stars. The town was dying a slow, painful death. Half the storefronts were boarded up with sun-bleached planks, their paint peeling like old skin. The other half barely clung to existence. Murphy's General Store had a broken window patched with brown paper, the barbershop's pole hadn't been painted in years, and the hotel's sign hung crooked, one chain having snapped in some forgotten windstorm. Jake had seen dozens of towns like this one scattered across the territory, places where hope had dried up faster than the creek beds in drought season. His horse, a sturdy bay named Thunder, was a magnificent animal, 16 hands high with a coat the color of burnished copper and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand his master's restless spirit. Thunder snorted and shook his powerful head, his ears flicking forward and back, sensing his rider's deep unease. The horse had been Jake's only constant companion for 3 years now, ever since that black day when he'd lost his family ranch to the bank, a spread that had been in the Morrison family for 2 generations, reduced to nothing by a combination of bad weather, failed crops, and the ruthless demands of Eastern creditors who saw human suffering as merely numbers on a ledger. No destination, no purpose, just a man and his horse moving from one forgotten town to the next, like tumbleweeds blown by winds that never seemed to settle. Jake had once been a man of substance, a landowner, a pillar of his community. Now he was a ghost, drifting through the remnants of a world he no longer recognized. The afternoon heat created shimmering waves that rose from the wooden buildings and the hard-packed earth of the street, creating an almost ghostly atmosphere that made the town appear to waver like a mirage. The air was thick and still, heavy with the scent of dust, horse manure, and the faint smell of decay that seemed to permeate dying places. Most folks had retreated indoors, seeking whatever meager shelter they could find from the sun's relentless assault, waiting for evening to bring even the smallest mercy of cooler air. Jake was about to guide Thunder toward the saloon, not for drink, but for the promise of shade and perhaps a room for the night, when he heard it. A sound that made his blood run cold and his spine straighten in the saddle. Crying. Not just any crying, but the desperate, muffled sobs of someone trapped, someone in genuine distress. It was a sound that spoke of hopelessness, of fear so deep it had settled into the very bones of whoever was making it. Jake pulled Thunder to a stop near Murphy's General Store, his keen ears, sharpened by years of survival in lawless territories where the difference between life and death often came down to hearing trouble before it found you, trying to locate the source. The sound seemed to be coming from behind the building, near the loading dock where freight wagons usually parked to unload their cargo. His instincts, honed by war and hardship, told him something was very, very wrong. The crying was rhythmic, punctuated by what sounded like someone trying to catch their breath, trying to be quiet but failing. It was the sound of someone who had been crying for hours, someone whose hope was nearly gone. Dismounting quietly, Jake tied Thunder's reins to a hitching post with practiced efficiency. His movements were fluid, economical, the movements of a man who had learned to waste neither time nor energy. He adjusted his gun belt, feeling the familiar weight of his Colt .45 against his hip, and walked toward the back of the store with careful, measured steps. The crying grew louder, more distinct as he approached. It was definitely a woman, young by the sound of it, and she was terrified. There was something about the quality of the sound, the way it seemed to come from an enclosed space, that made Jake's jaw clench and his hands curl into fists. Behind the building, in the shade of an overhanging roof, Jake found a large wooden crate that made his stomach turn. It was roughly the size of a small room, maybe 6 feet by 4 feet, constructed of rough pine boards with air holes drilled along the sides in a methodical pattern. The craftsmanship was professional, deliberate. This wasn't some hastily constructed prison, but something built with forethought and planning. The crying was coming from inside, and Jake could see scratches around the air holes where fingernails had clawed at the wood. His jaw tightened as he approached, his hand instinctively moving to the worn grip of his Colt .45. The weapon had been his father's, passed down through 3 generations of Morrison men, and it had never failed him when he needed it most. "Hello," he called softly, his voice gentle despite the rage building in his chest. "Anyone in there?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by shuffling sounds and what sounded like someone trying to move in a very confined space. Then, a voice, fragile but trying to be brave, the voice of someone who had been pushed to the very edge of endurance. "Please, please don't hurt me. I've done nothing wrong." Jake's heart clenched. He'd seen a lot of evil in his travels across the territory: claim jumpers, cattle rustlers, men who'd kill for a handful of silver dollars. But this was something else entirely, something that spoke to a level of cruelty that went beyond mere greed or desperation. Someone had imprisoned this woman in a crate like she was cargo to be shipped, like she was nothing more than a piece of property. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jake said, his voice gentle but firm, carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of command. "My name's Jake Morrison. I'm going to get you out of there, I promise you that." He examined the crate carefully, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. It was secured with heavy iron bands that had been forged by a skilled blacksmith, and a large padlock that looked military in design. Professional work. Whoever had done this had access to quality materials and the skill to use them. This wasn't the work of common criminals, but of men with resources and connections. Jake pulled out his knife, a 7-inch blade with a bone handle that had been his companion through the war and the years since. He began working on the wooden slats near the lock mechanism, his movements careful and deliberate. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to keep the woman calm while he worked. He could hear her breathing, fast and shallow, the breathing of someone on the edge of panic. "Sarah? Sarah Fletcher," came the trembling reply. "Sir, you need to leave. If they find you here, they'll kill you. They've killed men for less." "Who's they?" Jake asked, prying at the wood with increasing urgency. The blade was making progress, but the construction was solid, built to last. The Maddox brothers. They own this town now. They own the sheriff, the judge, the bank. And they own me too, according to the deal they made with my father. Jake's blood boiled. He'd heard of the Maddox brothers, Dutch and Pike Maddox, notorious throughout the territory for their cruel business practices and complete disregard for human decency. They controlled several towns across Arizona and New Mexico through a combination of violence, bribery, and intimidation. They were men who had taken the lawlessness of the frontier and turned it into their own personal empire. "Nobody owns you," Jake said firmly, finally working loose a board near the lock. "What kind of deal?" Sarah's voice broke as she explained, the words coming out in a rush as if she'd been holding them back for too long. "My father, he's a good man, but weak. He gambled away our farm in Dutch Maddox's private poker game. When he couldn't pay his debts, nearly $3,000, Dutch Maddox said he'd forgive everything if I agreed to marry his younger brother, Pike. When I refused, when I told them I'd rather die than be sold like a broodmare, they locked me in here. They're shipping me to Pike's ranch tomorrow morning, like I'm a piece of livestock." Jake's hands stilled for a moment, rage building in his chest like a prairie fire. In all his years, through war and peace, through the best and worst of human nature, he'd never encountered something so coldly calculated, so utterly without humanity. Sarah Fletcher was being treated like livestock, traded to settle a debt she had no part in creating, her life and dignity considered nothing more than currency in the Maddox brothers' twisted business empire. "Well, Miss Fletcher," Jake said, resuming his work on the crate with renewed determination, "I've got news for the Maddox brothers. Their deal just got canceled." With a final, decisive pull, Jake broke through the wood around the lock mechanism. The metal band fell away with a clang that echoed in the afternoon air, and Jake pulled open the makeshift door he'd created. Inside, Sarah Fletcher sat huddled in a corner, her once fine blue dress torn and dirty, her auburn hair disheveled and tangled. But her green eyes, though filled with tears and exhaustion, showed a spark of defiance that hadn't been broken despite hours of confinement. She was beautiful, yes, but more importantly, she was strong. Even in her current state, beaten down but not defeated, she carried herself with a dignity that spoke to her character. "Come on," Jake said, extending his hand. "Let's get you out of there." As Sarah took his hand and stepped into the fading sunlight, Jake knew his drifting days were over. He'd found something worth fighting for again. Sarah Fletcher stumbled as she stepped out of the crate, her legs weak from hours of confinement. Jake steadied her with a firm but gentle grip, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of trouble. The back alley remained quiet, but he knew that wouldn't last long. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. I thought no one would find me until it was too late." Jake helped her to a wooden crate where she could sit and regain her strength. Up close, he could see the full extent of what she'd endured, not just the physical discomfort, but the emotional toll of being treated like property. Her hands shook as she smoothed her torn dress, trying to restore some dignity to her appearance. "How long have you been in there?" Jake asked, offering her his water canteen. "Since yesterday morning," Sarah replied, taking a grateful sip. "They came to our farm at dawn. He was crying when they took me. Said he had no choice, that the debt was too large. But I know Papa. He's not a bad man, just weak. The Maddox brothers prey on weak men." Jake's jaw tightened. "Where's your father now?" "Probably at the saloon, drinking away his guilt," Sarah said bitterly. "That's what he does when he can't face what he's done." Before Jake could respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the front of the building. Multiple sets, moving with purpose. Jake's hand moved to his gun as he motioned for Sarah to stay quiet. "Check around back," came a gruff voice. "Boss wants to make sure the package is secure before we load it tomorrow." Jake quickly assessed their options. The alley was a dead end, with only one way out, past whoever was coming. He helped Sarah to her feet, noting how she bit back a whimper of pain from her cramped muscles. "Stay behind me," he whispered. "When I say run, you head for my horse. He's tied up front." 3 men rounded the corner, all wearing the distinctive black vests that marked them as Maddox employees. The leader, a scarred man with dead eyes, stopped short when he saw the broken crate and the two figures standing beside it. "Well, well," the man said, his hand moving to his gun. "Looks like someone's been messing with Maddox's property." "The only property I see here is that broken crate," Jake replied calmly, positioning himself between Sarah and the three men. "And last I checked, folks weren't property in this country." The scarred man laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You must not be from around here, stranger. In Clearwater Creek, the Maddox brothers decide what's property and what ain't. Now step away from the girl." "I don't think so," Jake said, his voice steady despite the odds. The tension in the alley was palpable. Sarah could feel Jake's muscles coiled like a spring, ready to explode into action. She'd heard stories about gunfighters, but she'd never seen one in person, never witnessed the cold calculation that came over a man when violence was inevitable. "You're making a mistake," the scarred man warned. "Dutch and Pike Maddox don't take kindly to folks interfering with their business." "Then I reckon Dutch and Pike Maddox are going to be mighty disappointed," Jake replied. The scarred man's hand twitched toward his gun, but Jake was faster. In one fluid motion, he drew his Colt and fired. The shot echoed through the alley as the scarred man dropped, clutching his shoulder. The other two men scrambled for cover behind some barrels. "Run!" Jake shouted to Sarah, firing two more shots to keep the remaining men pinned down. Sarah ran, her heart pounding as she heard gunfire erupting behind her. When she reached the front of the building, she found Jake's horse exactly where he'd said it would be. Thunder seemed to sense the urgency, dancing nervously as Sarah approached. Moments later, Jake appeared, moving backward while keeping his gun trained on the alley. "We need to go," he said, untying Thunder's reins. "More will be coming." He helped Sarah mount, then swung up behind her. As they rode hard out of town, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror. She was free, but she knew the Maddox brothers would never let this stand. They controlled too much, had too much power. "Where are we going?" she asked over the sound of hoofbeats. "Somewhere safe," Jake replied. "I know a place about 10 miles north. Old friend of mine runs a small ranch there. We can figure out our next move." As they rode into the gathering dusk, Sarah realized she'd traded one uncertain future for another. But for the first time in days, she felt a spark of hope. The man behind her, this stranger who'd risked everything to free her, represented something she'd thought was gone from the world: genuine courage. The small ranch belonging to Jake's friend, Tom Bradley, sat nestled in a valley surrounded by red rock formations. It was modest but well-maintained, with a sturdy cabin, a barn, and a corral where a few horses grazed peacefully. As Jake and Sarah approached, Tom emerged from the cabin, rifle in hand but lowering it when he recognized his visitor. "Jake Morrison," Tom called out, his weathered face breaking into a grin. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon. And who's this lovely lady?" Jake dismounted and helped Sarah down, noting how she winced from the long ride. "Tom, this is Sarah Fletcher. We've had some trouble in town with the Maddox brothers." Tom's expression darkened immediately. "The Maddox brothers? Jake, you've got a talent for finding trouble. Come inside, both of you. We need to talk." Inside the cabin, Tom's wife, Martha, fussed over Sarah, providing her with clean clothes and a warm meal. The kindness of these strangers moved Sarah to tears. After days of being treated like cargo, simple human decency felt overwhelming. "The Maddox brothers have been tightening their grip on this entire territory," Tom explained to Jake as they sat by the fireplace. "They've got judges, sheriffs, and politicians in their pocket. Word is they're planning to expand their operations, turn this whole area into their personal kingdom." Jake stared into the flames, his mind working. What about the federal marshals? Surely someone's noticed what's happening. "The nearest federal office is in Tucson, 3 days' ride," Tom replied. "And by the time any marshal could organize a response, the Maddox brothers would have moved their operations or eliminated any witnesses." Sarah, now dressed in one of Martha's plain but clean dresses, joined them by the fire. "There's something else you should know about the Maddox brothers," she said quietly. "They don't just control towns through fear. They've been systematically destroying anyone who opposes them. My father told me about a rancher named Henderson who tried to organize resistance. They burned his ranch, killed his cattle, and ran him out of the territory. Jake felt a familiar fire building in his chest, the same righteous anger that had driven him to fight in the war, to defend his family's ranch until the very end. How many men do they have? Dutch keeps about 20 gunmen in town, Sarah replied. Pike has maybe 15 at his ranch. But they've got allies in other towns, men who owe them money or fear them too much to refuse their calls for help. The odds were daunting, but Jake had faced worse. During the war, he'd been part of a cavalry unit that had held off superior forces through strategic thinking and sheer determination. This situation called for the same approach. We can't run, Jake said finally. Even if we left the territory, they'd find us eventually. Men like the Maddox brothers don't forgive, and they don't forget. What are you suggesting? Tom asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. I'm suggesting we make a stand, Jake replied. But not just us, we need to rally the people they've been oppressing. Every town has folks who've suffered under Maddox rule. We unite them and we fight back. Sarah looked at Jake with a mixture of admiration and concern. You're talking about war. People will die. People are already dying, Jake said gently. Just slowly and without hope. At least this way, they'll have a chance to fight for something better. Martha, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. There's a traveling preacher who comes through these parts, Father Miguel. He ministers to folks in all the towns the Maddox brothers control. If anyone knows who might be willing to stand up to them, it would be him. Tom nodded. Miguel's due here day after tomorrow. He could carry word to the other towns, gauge who might be willing to join us. As the evening wore on, they planned their strategy. Jake would remain hidden at the ranch while Tom and Father Miguel reached out to potential allies. Sarah, despite Jake's protests, insisted on playing her part. She knew the territory better than anyone and understood the Maddox brothers' methods. Later that night, as the others slept, Jake found Sarah sitting on the porch, staring up at the star-filled sky. The desert night was cool, a welcome relief from the day's heat. You're thinking about your father, Jake said, settling beside her. Sarah nodded. He's probably wondering if I'm dead or worse. Despite everything, I still love him. He's just lost. When this is over, Jake said, we'll find a way to help him. Good men sometimes make bad choices when they're desperate. Sarah looked at him in the moonlight. Why are you doing this, Jake? You could have just freed me and ridden away. Why risk everything for people you don't even know? Jake was quiet for a long moment. Because I've been running for 3 years and I'm tired of it. I lost everything I cared about once, and I let it turn me into a ghost. But you? Helping you reminded me who I used to be. Who I want to be again. Sarah reached over and took his hand. Whatever happens, I want you to know, you've already saved me. Not just from that crate, but from giving up hope entirely. As they sat together under the vast desert sky, both knew that the coming days would test them in ways they couldn't imagine. But for the first time in years, Jake felt like he was exactly where he belonged. 2 weeks later, Jake stood on a ridge overlooking Clearwater Creek, watching the sun rise over the town that had become the center of his war against the Maddox brothers. Beside him, Sarah adjusted the rifle in her hands. She'd proven to be a surprisingly good shot during their preparation time. Father Miguel had exceeded all expectations in rallying support. Word had spread through the territory's oppressed communities like wildfire, and now Jake commanded a force of nearly 60 men and women, ranchers, store owners, farmers, and even some former Maddox employees who'd grown disgusted with their employer's cruelty. The Maddox brothers brought in reinforcements from Tucson, reported Charlie Henderson, the son of the rancher who'd been driven out years earlier. We count about 50 guns in town, maybe 20 more at Pike's ranch. Jake nodded. The numbers were roughly even, but the Maddox forces had better weapons and more experience. However, Jake's people had something the enemy lacked. They were fighting for their homes, their families, and their future. Remember the plan, Jake addressed his gathered force. We hit the town at dawn, when most of them are still sleeping off last night's drinking. Tom's group takes the saloon. Charlie's team secures the jail and releases any prisoners. Sarah and I will go after Dutch Maddox directly. What about Pike? asked Maria Santos, a shopkeeper whose husband had been killed by Maddox's men for refusing to pay protection money. Pike's at his ranch, 15 miles east, Jake replied. Once we control the town, we'll deal with him. But Dutch is the real power. Take him down, and the rest will scatter. As the first rays of sunlight painted the desert landscape gold and red, Jake's forces moved into position. The town lay quiet below, unaware that its day of reckoning had arrived. Jake and Sarah approached the hotel where Dutch Maddox maintained his headquarters. The building was heavily guarded, but Jake had studied the layout carefully. They would enter through the back stairway, avoiding the main lobby where Dutch's men would be stationed. "You sure about this?" Sarah whispered as they climbed the rear stairs. "Too late to back out now," Jake replied, though he felt the familiar pre-battle tension knotting his stomach. They reached the third floor without incident. Dutch's room was at the end of the hall, and Jake could hear voices inside. Dutch was meeting with his lieutenants, probably planning their next moves. Jake counted at least 3 distinct voices, maybe 4. Taking a deep breath, Jake kicked open the door and dove inside, Sarah right behind him. Dutch Maddox, a large man with silver hair and cold blue eyes, was indeed meeting with 3 of his men. Surprise gave Jake the advantage he needed. "Nobody move!" Jake shouted, his Colt trained on Dutch while Sarah covered the others. Dutch Maddox smiled, seemingly unperturbed by the sudden intrusion. "Jake Morrison, I presume. You've caused me considerable trouble, son." "The trouble's just beginning," Jake replied. "Your reign of terror is over, Dutch." "Is it?" Dutch asked, his smile widening. "Look out the window, Morrison. Look at what your little rebellion has accomplished." Jake kept his gun trained on Dutch but risked a glance toward the window. Down in the street, he could see the battle raging. His people were fighting bravely, but the Maddox forces were putting up fierce resistance. Buildings were burning, and he could see bodies in the street. "You've turned this town into a war zone," Dutch continued. "How many innocents will die because of your moral crusade?" "The innocents have been dying for years," Sarah interjected, her voice steady despite the chaos outside. "You and your brother have been killing this entire territory slowly. At least now people have a chance to fight back." Dutch's eyes narrowed as he looked at Sarah. "The Fletcher girl. You've cost me a great deal of money, young lady. Pike was quite looking forward to your companionship." Jake's finger tightened on the trigger. "Watch your mouth, Dutch. Or what? You'll shoot me in cold blood? I don't think you have it in you, Morrison. You're too noble, too righteous. That's why you'll lose." The sound of gunfire outside intensified, and Jake could hear his name being called from the street. His forces needed leadership, needed to see that their cause was just and winnable. "Maybe you're right," Jake said quietly. "Maybe I am too noble to shoot you in cold blood. But I'm not too noble to see justice done." In one fluid motion, Jake struck Dutch with the butt of his gun, dropping the older man to the floor. The 3 lieutenants started to move, but Sarah's rifle stopped them cold. "The choice is yours," Jake told them. "You can surrender and face trial, or you can die fighting for a man who'd sell his own mother for profit." One by one, the lieutenants threw down their weapons. Dutch, dazed but conscious, glared up at Jake from the floor. "This isn't over," Dutch snarled. "Pike will never surrender. He'll burn this whole territory before he gives up." "Then we'll stop him too," Jake replied. "But your part in this is finished." As Jake and Sarah led their prisoners downstairs, they found that the battle was turning in their favor. The sight of Dutch Maddox in chains had broken the morale of his remaining men. Some surrendered, others fled into the desert. By noon, Clearwater Creek was free. The cost had been high. 12 of Jake's people had died, and the town bore the scars of battle. But for the first time in years, the people could walk their streets without fear. Sarah found her father at the saloon, sober for the first time in weeks. The reunion was tearful but healing. James Fletcher had watched the battle from his window, seeing his daughter fight for the freedom he'd been too weak to defend. "I'm proud of you, Sarah," he whispered as he held her. "And I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry." "It's over, Papa," she replied. "We're free now." Jake stood in the doorway, watching the reunion. Tom Bradley joined him, sporting a bandaged arm from the battle. "Pike Maddox is still out there," Tom said. "Word is he's gathering men, talking about revenge." Jake nodded. "We'll be ready for him. But this time, we won't be fighting alone." As evening fell over Clearwater Creek, Jake and Sarah walked through the town they'd helped liberate. The buildings were scarred, and the people were exhausted, but there was something new in the air: hope. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Jake looked at her, this remarkable woman who'd shown him the way back to himself. "Now we build something better. We prove that good people can win when they stand together." Taking her hand, Jake Morrison, no longer a drifting cowboy but a man with purpose, walked toward whatever tomorrow might bring. The desert night was cool and clear, full of promise and new beginnings. The end.